afternoon. I'm really glad to welcome you on our next session about digital transformation. My name is Lela Machaidze. I am co-host of this event, and I am professional project management, and I'm really passionate about anything related to project management. And digital transformation is one of the spheres that is really dear to my heart. Couple words about the logistics of today's event. The webinar will continue for 1 hour. It will be short presentation, 20, 30-minute presentation by our guest. Then we will have a Q&A session. So during the presentation, feel free to put your questions in the chat section, and we will be addressing them later. So today it is my real pleasure to present and be co-host of this session with the Professor Gerald Kane. He's a professor of information systems and faculty director at the Edmund Shea Junior Center for Entrepreneurship at Boston's Carroll School of Management. Very soon, probably in a couple of months, Jerry will be joining the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business as the C. Herman and Mary Virginia Terry Chair in Business Administration in the Management Information System Department. He researches and teaches how companies can understand and respond to digital disruptions. He provides his lectures and teaching for graduate, executive, and undergraduate students. So this is my pleasure to present two book authors about the digital transformation. One is the technology fallacy, and the second one that we will be discussing today is about the transformation myths, how leading your organization through uncertain times. Welcome, Jerry. I'm really pleased to have you here, and I'm really thrilled to have all your knowledge, to listen to all your knowledge and findings and researches in this book and presentation. So, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I very much appreciate the invitation and the time to present to you. I'll actually be weaving together the findings from my two books, The Technology Fallacy and The Transformation Myth, because they do relate to each other quite well. To let you know where this came from, for 5 years, I worked on a joint initiative between MIT Sloan Management Review and Deloitte, investigating how legacy companies were adapting to digital business or a digital world. Over the course of this time, we first did a quantitative survey. So every year we would send out surveys to the MIT Sloan mailing list. And over the course of 5 years, we got a total of 20,400 plus respondents. And if you look to the right of the slide, about a third of these were at companies with more than $1 billion in revenue, spanning 157 different countries, 28 industries, with about a third being inside the United States and about 2/3 being outside the United States. Combining with the quantitative survey, we actually also interviewed over 100 executives who were leading their organization through digital change, from traditional companies like Walmart and Caterpillar and Harley Davidson, to more tech companies like your Facebooks and your Googles, et cetera, et cetera. Those interviews, I think, were amongst the most rewarding part of the project for me, to actually talk with people on what they were dealing with in this. Every year in our survey, perhaps the most important question is something we called digital maturity. If you look at the very small print here at the bottom, sorry, I have a little bit of cold, so I'm drinking tea while I talk. Imagine an ideal organization utilizing digital technologies and capabilities to improve business processes, engage talent across the organization, and drive new and value-generating business models. How close is your organization to that ideal on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being as far from that ideal as possible, and 10 being we are the ideal digital company? And what you see is we group these further. If a respondent responded that their company was between a 1 and a 3, we called those early stage companies, and that was about 25% of our respondents. If they rated themselves between a 4 or a 6, we called these developing organizations, and then 7 or above is maturing. And so we use these 3 breakout groups to discuss many of our results. And if you look at the gray bar below, one thing that was somewhat heartening is we saw a definitely shift towards digital maturity over the 5 years of our research. 9 percentage points fewer place themselves in the early stage, with 3 and 5% respectively placing themselves in developing and then maturing. So we see this shift towards digital maturity over the 5 years of our research. So we were planning a follow-up book on this, and we had actually submitted the proposal late February, early March 2020, at what point we realized that the world was going in a very different direction than we had expected. And so in that pitch meeting, we pivoted and said, you know what, much of our findings from the first book are proving to be relevant to what companies are dealing with respect to COVID. How about we study that while we're here? And they said, great. The only problem is you have to have it done by December. So between March and December of 2020, we lived through a pandemic, we researched the pandemic, we wrote a book on the pandemic, which was both very rewarding and extremely stressful. So it was, it was inspiring to talk to leaders who are helping their companies navigate these uncertain times, but stressful because the phenomenon was unfolding as we studied it. We had no idea sort of where we would end up. And the reason we found that they were the findings from the first book was relevant to COVID is we talk about it in 2 forms of it's all about disruption. So chronic disruption is what we studied in the technology fallacy, which is really about digital disruption. And it's a more chronic change. It's slow building and persistent. It's not always obvious. You can overlook it for the short term. It requires sustained treatment that must be tolerable over time. And it's long lasting and can't simply be cured. In contrast, COVID, we thought was an acute disruption. And like an acute medical condition, these are sudden, rapid, and often severe onset, obvious attention grabbing, requires rapid and dramatic responses, and requires, and by definition, they're somewhat temporary. So what we're talking about, I think, in both digital disruption and COVID is companies being disrupted from their usual way of business. One just happens at a much quicker time frame than the other. And so I'll present findings from both of these books. You can see first one, both have been fairly well received. And we're going to go through this structure that we use in the technology fallacy, navigating disruption, becoming a digital organization, and rethinking leadership and talent. Together, I call these 2 books uncovering the 2 lies of digital transformation. The first lie is what we uncover in the technology fallacy, and that's that transformation always involves implementing digital tools. We had a number of examples where to respond to digital change didn't involve technology at all. So one organization, for instance, had a tuition reimbursement program that they tailored to say, if you're getting a degree in an area that's strategically important for the organization, we will reimburse you at 3 times the normal rate. So it gave them skills necessary to work in a digital world, but did not involve technology at all. The second is the transformation myth, and this dispels the lie that transformation is always a single transformation. And in fact, when we sat down to study COVID, in fact, we found that multiple types of disruption were happening on top of each other, whether it be racial injustice in the United States, whether it be continued climate change, whether it be supply chain disruption, whether it be now about war in Russia. All these disruptions, they are not treated separately. They all happen on top of and interact with each other. So just like there's no single disruption, responding does not involve a single transformation. So let's look at what we're dealing with. Perhaps my favorite slide, and I'll say that probably a couple times throughout this presentation, is we asked respondents, is your organization going to be in a stronger or a weaker position going forward, and why? And for the whys, we actually gave them a text box and just said, fill it in. And I had my research assistants at Boston College go through and read all of these 3,300 responses and code them into categories. And what was interesting that we found out here was those that said we were going to be in a weaker position going forward blamed it on market and competitive forces. Those who said we're going to be in a stronger position going forward said we're going to be able to develop the digital capabilities we need to thrive. And so I go back to the work by Stanford psychologist Carroll, who differentiates between fixed and growth mindset. Fixed mindset, you believe your talent is inherent to who you are, and thus success or failure is a result of environmental conditions. For growth mindset people, they say, success or failure is a result of my hard work, and my skills are a result of the work I put into it. And here I see a growth mindset story for organizations. Those who say we're going to be in a weaker position say, the market's doing it to us, or competitors are doing it to us. There's nothing we can do to fight off this change. Whereas those who say we're going to be stronger, they have a growth mindset. They say, we can develop the skills and capabilities to compete in a digital future. Growth mindset was also characteristic of companies' response to COVID. I was really surprised at how often our respondents indicated that for their career and for their company, COVID was a huge positive because it brought about the types of changes that they needed to do anyway. And we argue that COVID really went through 3 stages of disruption. First is responding. This was March and April of 2020, where companies tried to figure out, how do we even do business in this situation? How do we work remotely? How do we keep the lights on? Then we moved to recover, and I would argue that's really May of 2020 to today. And it's how do we sort of make sense of this disrupted environment, and how do we take advantage of the opportunities that this disruption causes us? And then thrive stage, I think we're still not there yet, because as we come back to the new normal, as we can all go back to the office full time globally, as supply chains sort of begin to settle back down, what are the new capabilities we've developed to do business better than before? And I think companies are really facing a decision point at this point. Some want to go back to the way things were before 2020 and just let's get back to business as usual. Others want to take the advances that they made through the pandemic and really double down and sort of become a leaner, more competitive organization. And I would argue those latter ones are those that are going to emerge stronger and really thrive. So let's look at part 2, rethinking leadership and talent for a digital age. I had the working hypothesis that basically digitally maturing companies had better leaders. And in fact, I didn't find that much at all. So if you look at the gold line, this asks the question, does your organization need to find new leaders to succeed in the digital age? And yeah, there's a little bit different. About 80% of early stage companies and about 50 to 60% of digitally maturing companies said we need new leaders. But the blue line is where things are really separate. Is your organization effectively developing the leaders who have the capabilities necessary to lead in a digital environment? There we see this huge gap, ranging from 10% for early stage companies up to 60 to 70 for maturing companies. So the bigger differentiator is not whether you have the leaders, is are you doing what you need to develop the leaders for the future? What does that look like? We asked an open text question, what leadership skills are most important in a digital world? And you see here things like transformative vision, being forward-looking, being change-oriented, and lastly, having a technology understanding. Now, this technology understanding is much more about digital literacy. Do you have an understanding of the tech trends? Not can you be an AI developer or do big data analysis. Now, I would argue it's awfully hard to have a transformative vision and to be forward-looking if you don't have that technology understanding, but it's not fundamentally about the technology. Second question is, how do we go about retaining talent? There's the old joke where the CFO says, what if we train people when they leave? And the CEO says, what if we don't and they stay? And I had another working hypothesis that basically digitally maturing company were going to have better talent. And in fact, when we asked, do you need a significantly new or different talent base to compete effectively in the digital economy? Again, not a huge difference. About 80% of early stage companies said that, going down to 50 to 60% of more maturing companies. So there's big differentiation here. But Is your organization's embrace of digital attracting new talent? Here we see a very significant gap. Whereas everybody needs new talent, digitally maturing companies say, and our maturity is going to help us attract more talent. And if we look at how they're finding talent, and we break up in early, developing, and maturing, developing and maturing companies say we're developing our employees for a digital future. I was interviewing the chief digital officer of the global insurer MetLife. And I said, how do you find new digital leaders? And he said, don't get me wrong, I'm always on the lookout for better digital talent. But my job is to make sure that people we have the skills that they need. But if you look one level down, I think it's interesting that maturing companies, their second most common way of finding employees is recruiting digital employees. That's huge. So they're coming after the best digital talent elsewhere. And then if you look at early stage companies, the second most common was, I don't know how we're getting new talent. So talent acquisition is much more intentional in the developing and maturing phases here. And this, taken together, this one basically says, the digitally maturing companies are taking better advantage of the talent they do have in-house. This red line, do you lack sufficient talent today to support the organization's digital business strategy? That goes down as you get more mature. And then are you providing your employees with the resources and opportunities to thrive? And do you effectively utilize the digital knowledge, skills, and experience held by your employees? Again, it's not that they have better talent necessarily, it's that they're making better use of the talent that they do have. So last but not least, becoming a digital organization. I had worked with this team for about 3 years. And once I built trust with my research team, I said, I really don't like this early developing and maturing framework. It seems very consultant-y. Why don't we look at something different? Let's come up with a cultural index of digital maturity. And let's look at different ways that companies can be digitally mature. And so we created this index. And when we did the data analysis, lo and behold, we found that there was a strong correlation between certain cultural characteristics and digital maturity. That digitally maturing companies were more likely to increase agility, more likely to encourage experiments and continual learning, more likely to recognize and reward collaboration, more likely to accept risks of failure, and more likely to be organized around cross-functional teams. And in fact, when we did a cluster analysis on this data, it broke out into a 3-cluster solution, basically saying, yes, your early developing and maturing framework does work, and it's very highly associated with the culture of the company. And so when many executives ask where they should start, I say, I don't know where you need to start strategically or technologically, but I do know where you need to start culturally. And so these are the things you're going to need sort of regardless of what you want to do digitally. Second, digital maturing companies were more likely to say that this culture was intentional. 80% said that they are actively implementing initiatives to strengthen their culture by bolstering risk-taking, agility, and collaboration, and are also more likely to report increasing investment in those in the next 12 to 18 months. In contrast, 23% of early stage companies said we are doing something about this. Last but not least, these digitally maturing companies are using culture to drive digital business adoption. We asked them, what's the biggest way your company does digital business? Early stage companies said we mandate it from the management. The boss says do it, so we do it. Developing companies just expect employees to be motivated to embrace digital business opportunities. And then last but not least, maturing companies cultivate a strong digital business culture that strives for risk-taking, collaboration, agility, and continuous learning. So that begs the question, if the rich are going to keep getting richer, or the maturing companies are going to separate out more for the future. Because if culture drives digital transformation and digitally mature companies are investing more in their culture, we may see this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. On the flip side, my working hypothesis as a silver lining from COVID, can COVID help companies build momentum with respect to digital transformation? Many companies engaged in about 10 years worth of digital transformation over the course of the 2 years of the pandemic. And once they've shown that they can do these things, they can work remotely, they can be flexible, they can have risk tolerance because they don't know what the answer is and what tomorrow is going to be. My hope is this has shown them that they can do the types of changes that they need to compete in a digital world. And just as many companies did 10 years worth of digital transformation over the course of about 18 months, I would argue they were about 10 years behind going into the pandemic. And so now the question is, they have developed these capabilities. I think the real question is going to be, what are they going to do now? One of the big questions is, what do we do with the workplace? Do we sort of go back full time? Do we go hybrid? Do we stay remote? And I sort of laugh at the hybrid answer, because there are probably 1,000 different ways of doing hybrid work, and sort of figuring out what the right way for your company is going to be a non-trivial problem. And I hope companies are sitting down and thinking through, what does hybrid work look like in a way that's going to be productive for us? And we see that there are pros and cons of remote work. Pros, no commute, it's efficient. Many companies said we were more productive, more meetings, but they're shorter. Some of the cons are, it's hard to build culture, it's hard to build innovation, it's hard to start new projects, building trust and rapport, mentoring and coaching. And so how do you bring both of these two together in a hybrid environment when, and looking at these post-pandemic challenges, not everybody agrees on what they want the workplace to look like. Younger people tend to favor more in-person interactions because there's much more of a social environment, and they don't have as comfortable of a work from home environment. Was older people like me are thrilled to be working from home because I can see my kids when they come home from school, and I have a dedicated office that I'm presenting to you from today, et cetera, et cetera. So there is not going to be a one size fits all for organizations. Yes, it's going to be important, because the type of decisions you make about the remote workplace is going to determine what types of talent you attract going forward. Last but not least, and this is my last set of slides, somewhat surprisingly, we asked to what extent their teams were organized around cross-functional project teams, and did management structure and practices interfere with their ability to do digital business successfully. We see digitally maturing companies more likely to be organized around cross-functional teams, and they're managing those teams differently. They're more likely to give them autonomy on how to accomplish their goals. That's the first one, 69 to 38%. They're more likely to evaluate the performance of the teams as a unit instead of only evaluating the individual performances of people on that team. And then the organization's senior leadership effectively creates an environment where our cross-functional teams succeed. So senior leadership's creating an environment where they can thrive. So that's my introduction. As I start coughing, I made it all the way through. Two books, The Technology Fallacy and The Transformation Myth, both available at a bookstore near you. Also, if you go to my website, profkane.com, I have a number of additional resources, including a series in the Wall Street Journal on profiles of leadership from the companies that we interviewed for The Transformation Myth, because there were so many good stories that we couldn't fit them all into a book. So we also did a separate series that we've been publicizing through that. So that's what I have, and I just open it up to you for what questions you might have for me.
Excellent, thank you. It was very, very eye-opening, and so much work is done, so much interviews, and especially it is interesting that the timing probably it was bad that the COVID pandemic hit, but for the research standpoint, I think it was the best time to hit, because you can really differentiate before and after, and you manage to fit it into one project. And it is really, really nice shift what COVID and this disruption, as you call, it's not chronic, you call it how? Acute disruption. So, yes. And this acute disruption is happening with the war, and we don't know, it may be happening in the nearest future. And as you mentioned, the digital transformation for companies, which is supposed to be happening in 10 years now, because of the COVID, they happen almost in 2 years. So the speed is probably really high. And I think not probably, but it's obviously is very high. The question that that I was kind of marking when you were doing presentation. You talked about the staff and the talent acquisition process, that most of the tendency and the trend that we saw is keeping the employees and developing their upskilling or reskilling their existing employees so they retain. So do you, I may miss, but so digitally mature companies have more chances to retain those employees. This is how I understood, right?
Yes. So actually, some data I did not present here. If you looked at, so one was that people generally wanted to work for digitally maturing companies, and that was true across age groups. So we expected it a little more with younger employees, and that was not the case. It was fairly stable throughout all our demographics. And then what was somewhat interesting was we asked how likely they were to leave in the course of given digital trends. And something like 30% of employees said they were looking to leave early stage companies in a year. So they're actively looking to get out. But when you ask to what extent their organization was helping them develop skills for a digital world, that cut the likelihood by wanting to leave, in some cases by up to 15 times.
Wow.
And so it went from like 40% to 2% or something ridiculous like that. And so it's not that people just want to flee a ship that they feel is not strategically on, heading in the right direction. They want to make sure they're in a position where they can keep developing their skills. And as long as they can do that, they're willing to keep working with the organization. When they get to the point where they feel like they're in a dead-end job and they can't develop the skills to stay relevant, that's when they look to leave.
So this finding is very instrumental for the strategic planning for talent acquisition teams, for HRs, and anybody who is planning for future development, because more finances, more budget probably should be planned for the development of those employees. So it's a big shift for the companies. So not only they become digitally mature, but also employee-wise, they also are more caring about their development.
Yes.
So it's really interesting.
And then when you're comparing yourself as far as digital maturity goes, you're not comparing yourself to other organizations in your industry. You're comparing yourselves to the Facebooks, the Google, the Amazons, because almost all of your employees are accustomed to dealing with these organizations, are accustomed to very seamless digital environments. And then they go to your workplace and it's much less polished. And in fact, I interviewed the chief human relations officer of Disney. And he said it's actually easier with our current systems for people outside the company to apply for jobs here than it is for somebody inside the company. Like the very people we want to keep, we make it hard for them with the systems to apply for jobs internally. And so, and he said the only restaurant.
Unusual. It's very unusual.
And he said that the only organization or the only restaurant their employees couldn't order from a mobile app on was their own internal cafeteria. And so like everybody else, it was just easier. They're used to dealing with it. And so, creating more seamless processes for employees, I think is imperative as well.
Interesting. When you started the presentation, you mentioned 156 countries were reached. I wonder if you have any differentiation for the developing countries. What are the trends? And if you interviewed any of those countries?
We did not. So you can actually, if you go to the MIT SMR website, we did open source all this data. So you can actually go through and click and look. We didn't do, my recollection is we did some of this initially, but we didn't find much of interest, most likely because we sort of retained a bit of a bias sample. By going through the MIT mailing list, we sort of got a more tech savvy group, and many of the truly non-mature or early stage companies might have not responded, just because they didn't have access to it. So that could have been why, but certainly anecdotally, as I talk with, I interviewed a Greek frozen vegetable company, which actually was amazing because it was one of the most digitally mature companies I'd talked to. But they said one of their main concerns was the lack of stability of broadband internet for their operations out in the rural areas, that they couldn't be as digitally mature as they wanted because the national infrastructure simply wasn't there. And so you see differences certainly like that, is to what extent is the infrastructure enable them to sort of be digitally mature.
It's interesting. Was there any differentiation between segments? For example, the company you mentioned, was there any differentiation of the digital maturity in the segments in construction? Obviously, IT and finance,
Yep.
They will be most mature, but what was the trend, if you can remember that?
Usually we called them the usual suspects, and that was technology, media, telecom, and professional services were sort of the leaders across most digitally. And retail struggled a little bit, government struggled a little bit. But one thing that was interesting, and I know we have this graph in the book, although there were three clear leaders, there wasn't necessarily one clear laggard. That even things like real estate had certain areas where they were sort of being very forward thinking. And being very digital. And so all of these places, there's nobody, whereas three industries always scored at the top, no single industry consistently scored at the bottom of all of our metrics, suggesting that there's something to hope for. There are some strengths that everybody can start building on.
So this mindset, this growth mindset,
yes,
was persistently existing. Most of those companies who are actually digitally. So this helps them to keep on the surface, right?
Yes.
Growth mindset.
Yep. And when I go into companies, that's what I talk about the most, is just making sure, because you hear fixed mindset statements all the time. We're not a technology company. We're a legacy company. It's like something built in that's keeping you from being more digitally advanced or being more innovative. And I think that's just an excuse. Yes, it certainly can be harder if you're a legacy company, but we see some legacy companies doing some really amazing stuff out there. And when we talk about legacy, I think it's important to differentiate. We actually have two phases of legacy companies in our data. Anything under 10 years old or anything older than 10 years old is a legacy company. Basically, I would argue anything pre-mobile device era, if you were founded, you're by definition a legacy company. And what's interesting is that includes companies like Facebook and Google and Apple, because they predated all of the mobile environment. And then 50 years or older is another set of legacy, that just being around for that long is longer and sort of puts you in a different category.
So those legacy companies, how they're doing with all these big corporations? How is it easy to deal with the bigger scale for them?
We actually find the ones that struggle the most are mid-sized companies. Big companies, yes, they have the problem of more bureaucratic established systems, but they have the money to throw at the problem, and they can go buy Oracle, or they can go buy Workday, or they can buy their way out of some of these problems.
They acquire a company which is digitally mature,
absolutely.
And this will balance.
Small companies are more agile because they don't have sort of the same problems. And then mid-size, sort of, you've got the bureaucratic and the legacy, but you don't have the resources to buy your way out of it. And those are the ones that sort of, I think, are most at risk.
Yeah, it makes sense. It really makes sense. And I really loved the statement when companies come and ask me where I should start the digital transformation.
Yep.
Is the first place, the priority one is the cultural.
Yes.
Because anything that will be done and is done in the companies done by people, and the culture really affects how they do and what type of even mindset do they have.
Yes. And then if you put in all these fancy new systems, but you don't change the culture, the amount that you're going to be able to sort of take advantage of those systems are limited. So yeah, you may have real-time data collection now and analysis and very robust data, but if you still have to go up through 5 levels of bureaucracy to get approval for a decision, you're only going to act so quickly. And so if you do the technology without the culture, you're only going to get so far. And so that's why I suggest starting with the culture.
And also what is interesting, are the companies preparing for their employees? So we understand that they want to keep their best of the talents and upskill and reskill them. Are they prepared, or are they preparing their employees for any future disruptions? How they are preparing and how they are nurturing the culture. This is the interesting part.
Yes. And by and large, our data suggests that most companies are doing a very poor job of this. Everybody knows it's happening. So employees say 90% said I need to update my skill set at least yearly. 45% I need to update my skills continually to work in a digital world. Yet less than half say my organization's doing enough to help me sort of develop these skills. Now, I don't think it's just about training. It's more about creating work environments that you can make use of these skills and really create more of an entrepreneurial mindset. And a lot of companies do this with internal incubators or innovation labs or new ways of working. One guy at Chip Joyce at Allied Talent advocates a tour of duty model where you work in one job for 3 years and then you go do something else within the company to develop new skill sets. Other companies, particularly tech companies, allow their employees a certain amount of time to work in open source software environments, like 5 or 10% of their time, reasoning that they're going to get as much back in new skill development for their employees if they let them do that. So there's all sorts of different ways.
Usually one of the challenges that I find when I talk with the CEOs and the companies, big companies, actually I find that whenever they do these skill development programs, it is hard to measure those skills. So how have you developed? What is the start point? Usually the big organization CEOs, they want to see data, how it was improved, the skill sets, how they were improved. For example, recently I become very interested in the adaptability skill, because we have this skill obviously from the very beginning as a species, but will we need it more and more as the changes and disruptions are coming more and more? So I'm talking with the companies about this skill, developing the skill, but they always ask, how do I know whether my employee has developed or increased or upskilled in adaptability? So this is about, probably if you can measure, then it's more obvious and believable. So will those skills be somehow measured, or what?
Yes, and there's actually a lot of research in this area right now. In fact, one of my colleagues at Boston College does all of his work on online labor markets. And the more we are, and what they're doing is using data from things like LinkedIn as people update their CVs and put skills down. And as you look at sort of what capabilities they have, you watch skill development over time. The other thing that's really interesting is a lot of these researchers are trying to develop AI recommendation engines, so that based on who you are, we recommend developing this skill, because that based on what we see, you're going to have the biggest impact there. You have organizations, there's one here in Boston called Burning Glass that collects all sorts of skill data and sort of are just looking at the trends and sort of figuring out how people develop skills, what skills are important, et cetera, over time. So I haven't done that, but I do know there's a lot of research out there. And when I interviewed the CEO of a European consulting company, And when I said if he could do his wish list of like what digital technology we have, that's what he wanted. It's like, how do we match the skills we have as a consulting company with the projects that we have? And if we had a system that could do that rather than our internal social networks, we would come a long way.
And there will be probably more objectivity than subjectivity. There will be less emotions, but maybe these emotions are also needed because those people are working with the team who are also perceive things emotionally, right?
Yep.
Not only with the data, it's also interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. We have comments in our chat section.
Yep.
I will address them. We have a comment from Arun. Hi, Arun. What are your thoughts on a shareholder with major stake on benefiting from return on investment during crisis of digital disruption?
Yeah, and so part of it is, some of it's about time horizon. So, stakeholder, it's really important to have shareholders not involved, but recognizing that these are changes that need to happen for long-term viability of the organization, and we see this all the time where executives I talk to say, look, I can only do so much because of Wall Street expectations. To me, that is such a fixed mindset approach. It's like, oh, sorry, the external forces, I can't do anything about it. There are plenty of visionary leaders that are going out there and saying, look, if great one is Walmart. Walmart said, if we look 10 years into the future, we know people are going to shop differently. And if we don't make changes, we're going to die. And if the Fortune 1 company said we need to change or die, everybody else does too. And so they said, and so they went to the board. They said, we need to make these changes. And the board said, sure. And it did have a negative short-term shareholder value, but the leaders said, we see the trends. We know that this is what needs to happen. And you need that visionary leadership to say, we need to move forward. Adobe is another great example. Moving from paid software to software as a service, they said we have to do this if we're going to survive. Another group I talked to, an CEO of an electric company, said our old AS400 systems couldn't handle our operational volume, and if we don't make these changes, yes, they cost. Yes, shareholders don't want to put the money into it, but if we don't do this, our long-term viability is zero, and so. Sort of, you need the bold leaders to come in and say, we need to make these directions and we need to make these moves, and explain it clearly to the shareholders. It was interesting about Adobe. If you look at their revenues when they shifted to software as a service, their revenues went down, but their stock price went up because they had communicated so well the nature of the business model change that they were trying to make, and people understood what they were trying to accomplish. So it's having that, when we look about what leadership characteristics are needed, when you have that vision for the future and communicate that vision, that's what helps get shareholders involved and on board.
Excellent. And actually, what I also think those CEO decision makers also need some upskill and reskilling to be in line what is happening, because they are also part of all this. So it has lots of load on them on this decision making, and they have to work internally with the teams as well with the shareholders. And they need to create this sense of urgency in the teams and drive the change and creating the shareholders. So they have to be leading the creation of this sense of urgency, right?
Yes. And the bright side is, I said, I often say it's much easier for me to teach the executive leaders the technology they need to survive and to thrive than it is to teach the digital leaders the other leadership skills that they need. So this isn't rocket science, going for the growth mindset. I would argue that all executive leaders can develop the skills they need to effectively lead into this future.
It can be learned, but it requires systematic and routine study and practice, lots of practice, because it's not like that you learn to use any type of software, but it is the skill that you have to exercise in practice.
Yes.
Yeah. Robin has a comment, I think, and the question probably, my system engineering professor used to say, a fool with a tool is still a fool, meaning just implementing new tools is not a panacea for your problems. People need to fully adopt the abilities that the tools provide through workflow and process improvement. People, process, tools, workflow, training, innovation. You need them all to be able to move forward and be successful.
Yes. And what's interesting about that, if Robin went through, we actually used that quote somewhere in the second book, A Fool with a Tool is Still a Fool. So that is very much aligned with our perspective. Also, in chapter 3, I think, of the first book, we use a model by Nadler and Tushman for HBS, Harvard Business School professors, that look at this alignment between people, processes, tools, and one other. And we're on board with that. I think one of the real, and so we're often get pushback. Okay, so then what's different about your book? Haven't we known this all the time? I think what's different is the technological infrastructure makes these things move so much more quickly. The people, the processes, the tools, the workflows, that you actually, it's stripping away our traditional ways of managing it don't work anymore. And we need new sort of management structures. We need new talent practices to sort of handle the speed at which these things are changing. So certain things haven't changed, like the fundamentals remain the same, but the fundamentals are moving so much faster nowadays that we need new ways to cope with them. And that's really the focus of our book.
Actually, what would be your top 3 besides the culture? Start with the culture. What will be your top first 3 advices to leaders who are thinking about the digital transformation?
First, know where you stand. So do some sort of inventory in your organization of where your maturity is, for 2 reasons. One, senior leadership often has a much more rosy view of how well the organization is doing than lower down, and getting a sense of that. Also, even though we talk about digital maturity as an organization level construct, in fact, it is unevenly distributed in your organization. So knowing where the strengths and weaknesses are, I think is really important. 2 is making sure the senior leadership takes ownership of it and doesn't just try to delegate it down. This really needs to be both a top-down and a bottom-up process, that neither works alone. You can't just say the boss have it, and it can't just be a bottom-up. It's got to be sort of both. You've got the boss has to have the vision, but has to create the environment where that vision can be lived out. And so that's 2. And so if I'm thinking of a third, it's don't get caught up in the flashy latest new technology. It's so easy to let's talk blockchain, let's talk NFTs, let's talk AI, let's talk about and sort of don't buy or implement technology just because there's a cool new technology to do. Making sure you understand the business case for it, I think, is and can articulate the business case for it, I think is particularly important. And I think you can actually get a whole lot of real value out of old technologies if you implement them in new ways. And so the technology is not the be all and end all of the solution.
Technology is just a tool that is making you to get to where you want to get. This is how I envision. This is just a mean, how fast and how you will get there. But and usually when we talk about the business case, I see that most of the digitally mature companies even change their business models. So change, you mentioned it in one of your cases, where the business model is completely changed. So it's interesting. I always think about those CEOs who are making change, working with the shareholders, working with the teams and driving this change. They're in very tough positions. They need to make decisions as quickly as possible, but the decisions worth of really high risk decisions.
Yes.
Affecting the being or not being, the company may be just, because of this decision, company may just die.
Yes.
As you mentioned. Yeah, it's changing. Well, I will encourage anybody, if you have questions, please feel free to ask those questions. We'll have a couple of minutes more. It was a really big pleasure for me to talk with you about this, because all the scientifically based evidences are really important, because we all talk about, we read the article there, but this scientifically proven data is so important. What do you think, what we should expect in next 2-3 years? One is probably
boy, I wish I had an answer to that, because I would be a lot richer if I did. I think the next 2 to 3 years are going to be some of the most disruptive, exciting, dangerous, scary of most of our lives, because I think you're going to see just massive reshaping of sort of the global business and political environment. And I wish I knew how it all was going to turn out. And I think the only thing you can do as a business leader is prepare yourself for change, and just know that disruption is going to be the new normal, and develop those skills as organizations and as leaders to be prepared to deal with that disruption.
Jerry, how to prepare for it?
It's making sure you are continually learning and developing new skills, making sure you stay nimble and agile so that you don't get stuck in one way of doing things and can sort of pivot to the new norms, that you're not entirely reliant on one organization, one supply chain, diversifying up. And so, I interviewed the CIO of CarMax, which is an auto retailer here in the US. And he said in 2016, I asked, how are you preparing? What are you doing digitally for your company? He said, I don't know what the next 5 years is going to bring. All I know is it's going to bring change. And the best thing I can do is to prepare for all possible futures, to be able to sort of become a change resilient organization. These smaller teams, flexible skill sets, ability to sense and get data collection so you know what's going on the ground. The more agile you can be, the more scalable you are. That's just going to sort of benefit for the future, no matter what that ends up looking like.
In project management, for example, in agile methodology, we have different frameworks, and it is very common and even plausible now to have in the teams generalists in the develop team, that they can do that they have skills that everybody can have. So you can easily switch from one job to another. So it is very interesting, because it is entire perspective shift, because we used to do one and be perfection in one specific point, and now you have to be you're changing maybe profession completely, your direction.
Yeah, it's risky to be pegged into one area, because that risk of change change is going to happen. And as I tell my son, when people ask him what he wants to be when he grows up, I've coached him to say, I don't know, the job I have hasn't been invented yet. And that's sort of like what any of us in 10 years, what are we going to be doing? I think the answer is we don't know, because in many cases, the jobs we're going to have, haven't even been invented yet.
Does it mean that we will need to acquire skills more than knowledge?
Yes. I mean, I think it's that, going back to continual learning, just sort of, I think the ability to learn is probably the most important thing. And when I teach my
unlearn?
students, the what?
Or unlearn?
Unlearn is also, I would put that into sort of agility. You need to be able to sort of forget things and move on. and continually sort of think your point of view, because assumptions that applied 10 years ago may no longer apply now.
How our education system is adapted to this?
That's, I know how I'm doing it. And that's just when I go in and teach them about digital, I tell them, anything I teach you now is going to be probably obsolete soon after you graduate. So what I try to do is to equip you to learn about technology, not to teach you something. So we do a much more critical, it's like we look at what's happening in the marketplace and we spend time talking about it and discussing the pros and the cons, and just sort of creating that ability for them to, I would argue we're in the golden age of education, through Khan Academy, through websites, through coding, you can teach yourself all sorts of skills these days, and sort of having the confidence to go and find where the skills are that you need and teach yourself. I think that's huge going forward.
And it is also a challenge, and it requires courage from the teachers, from professors, because we as the professors and teachers also need this the skills to teach our students. So it's also challenging I think it's
absolutely.
And it requires courage.
It does. And it also requires, at least for me, what I tell my students is, when talking about digital business, I know more than any of you in here. I probably know more than any 10 of you in here combined, but I don't know more than all 40 of you put together. And so what we're doing is we create an environment where I'm guiding them, they're teaching me, and we keep learning from each other. And then I take that learning from class 1 and I share it with class 2 the next semester. So I'm continuing to develop my skill set and my knowledge as a professor, because it all keeps changing. When you're studying digital, you just can't, I can't teach any other way because it all moves too fast.
Yeah. And today we discussed it with my colleagues, and sometimes you have to think about the reverse mentorship.
Yep.
When you have a mentor much younger, and in reverse, the younger mentee mentoring you at some point. This culture also should be in the companies and organizations privileged and promoted, because this is the culture will be helping organizations to stay more adaptive and flexible.
Yeah, the only pushback I have against reverse mentoring is when I work with undergrads, they have a very sophisticated procedural understanding of the technology. They don't necessarily understand the strategic side of the technology. And so if you engage in reverse mentoring without that critical eye, recognizing there's a lot that kids these days know, and there's also a lot that they don't know, and being able to learn from them while still keeping that critical eye on, I think is particularly important.
So maybe this is why it will be needed to have both the mature professional and the juniors working together. It will be filling the gap, and it will be even more efficient way of doing.
Yeah, and I prefer to think of it in terms of diverse learning communities rather than reverse mentor. It's like making sure we have different genders, different backgrounds, different ages, different skill sets, all learning from each other. That's how we make sure we cover the bases.
I see. We have Robin's comment here: teach a mindset using examples of evolution rather than narrow skills.
Absolutely. That's a good place to end it, I think, probably.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you all for attending, and thank you all for who will be watching. We have a question from, should we take this last one, Jerry?
Sure.
Do you have any learning which demonstrates such digital disruption available for a read based on the real-time examples?
Can you repeat that again? I'm not sure I understood the
question. Do you have any learning which demonstrates such digital disruption available for a read?
Yeah, I mean, I would just go to throughout the 2 books that I wrote, and go to my website. I've got, articles, and there are podcasts, and there are, I basically put everything up on my website. So there's a lot of good stuff up there. Sure. And I try to tell stories from these interviews, because that's what people care about. As I interview Hilton and Marriott and the airlines and, you know, restaurants, and all trying to work their way through disruption. It was a very sort of eye-opening experience for me, and I've tried to share as much as I can on that website.
And you already have follower. Robin said that it was very inspiring, and she already booked both of your books.
Excellent. Then it was all worthwhile. Robin's the star student then today.
Yes. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here, and have a nice day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Lela.